Our next paper is going to be delivered by Jonny Matfin from Birkbeck University, the Department of History, Classics, and Archaeology.
Thank you to Pat and all the organisers of MIW 2021. The title of my talk is In Pursuit of Useless Knowledge, Classics at Birkbeck, 1963 to 2003. Classics today occupies a much smaller place in British universities than 150 years ago. As the academic and critic Stephen Collini observes, the discipline has diminished from prerequisite for high office to hallmark of a gentleman and finally to favoured example of a useless subject. Indeed, in recent decades the discipline has been at the centre of conflict over the purpose of university education. This follows a significant shift in political ideology. Before the late 1970s, universities had expanded based on a welfare state model. Since 1979, however, successive governments have promoted new values and policies, resulting in severe reductions to university funding and new methods of auditing academic work. For classics, this political agenda manifested most extremely in nationwide cuts in the late 1980s, including the closure of Birkbeck's Department of Classics and Ancient History, Classics. Collini states that many arguments on the purpose of universities, including ideas on the alleged uselessness of classics, are so hackneyed as to be rendered abstract. This paper aims to introduce novel perspectives on recent changes to classics and British higher education more widely by moving away from abstraction to a close examination of the discipline's development in one department at one institution from 1963 to 2003. It briefly covers four areas: staffing, structure and funding, relations between academics and senior staff, responses to freezes and cuts in the 1960s and 70s, and existential crisis and closure in the 1980s, including reaction and eventual reinstatement. Classics at Birkbeck took three small forms between 1963 and 2003: an independent academic department, a reduced branch of the University of London run via King's College, and one section of a joint School of History, Classics and Archaeology. In 1963-64, Classics had four staff, including Eric Warmington as head of department, succeeded by Robert Browning in 1965-66. Five staff, including Browning, worked together until almost the end of the 1970s. In 1980-81, Browning retired and Professor David Hamlin was appointed head. In 1986-87, the headship transferred to Dr. Roland Meyer and Jane Rowlinson was hired. By 1989-90, however, Classics was diminished through transfer to King's, leaving just Rowlinson and a secretary. This skeletal staff maintained Classics teaching at Birkbeck until 1992-93, when Rowlinson was succeeded by Emma Dench. Dench subsequently oversaw Classics until the start of the new joint school in 1999-2000. Funding for Classics, through an annual central grant, was subject to frequent scrutiny, freezes and cuts. In February 1969, Birkbeck's master warned that the college risked an embarrassing incursion into reserves. Responding to the bleak news, Browning, as head of Classics, argued that an option of funding for more staff in his department should be retained until viable. Such interventions went beyond the bottom line, however. In January 1984, Hamlin, as head, asked the master for help with replacement teaching costs so that Meyer might go on research leave. Efforts were also made to help individual students. In June 1967, Browning wrote to Birkbeck's clerk to request research travel funds for an MPhil student, anonymised here as Mr. D, who as a low-paid teacher lacked means. Moreover, in June 1970, Browning advised the recently widowed wife of a non-Birkbeck scholar on how best to dispose of her late husband's library. The impression here is more than that of just an academic unit. It is perhaps closer to a community, one with concern for academic and personal welfare. There was also conflict, however. This was most evident with Giuseppe Gengrandi. Appointed as reader in 1962-63, Gengrandi clashed on a range of issues with colleagues and authorities inside and outside of Classics. In December 1975, he sent the first of many requests for a research assistant to Birkbeck's registrar. On hearing that it was unlikely to be granted, Gengrandi went straight to the top, to the master. The Italian scholar secured research help in 1977. The subject of his appeals to senior colleagues subsequently shifted to recognition of the work he now shared with his assistant, Dr. Heather White. In January 1979, Giangrandi wrote to Birkbeck's secretary asking, "Would you agree with me that Dr. White and I are by far the hardest working members of the academic staff?" This rhetoric related to the pair's commitment to postgraduate supervision over the Christmas break. Giangrandi's record was less commendable on undergraduate teaching, however. Hamlin, as head of classics, told the master in January 1984 that his annual attempts to get Giangrandi to give a course of BA lectures were always a ritual act. Giangrandi's prioritization of postgraduate research also manifested in an attempt to develop a new academic structure within classics. In August 1975, he sent a confidential letter to Birkbeck's registrar, making the case for a new research centre. He argued, "We are de facto already a research centre. We have the largest number of classics postgraduates that any college can boast of in this country." The proposal was rejected on grounds of scale and cost, and a potential conflict of interest with the University of London's Institute of Classical Studies, ICS. Giangrandi persisted, however, telling Browning in January 1977 that a sub-departmental title, if not an actual entity, was vital for research funding. The issue came to a head later the same month when Giangrandi approached external parties. Browning informed the master that Giangrandi had appealed to the Labour government's Secretary of State for Education, Shirley Williams. Separately, the master received a letter from the chairman of the University Grants Committee, UGC, Sir Frederick Dainton, with a copy of a direct plea for financial support he had received from Giangrandi. Giangrandi's letter began, "I am writing to you in my capacity as head of one of the largest and most productive research schools in classics in Great Britain." The master's response to Giangrandi was blunt, stating, "As far as the college is concerned, there is a single department of classics, of which Professor Browning is the head." These examples of conflict in classics clearly illustrate the complexity of personal-professional relations at a departmental level, what the university historian Sheldon Rothblatt refers to as the play of personalities too intricate for summary. In addition, Giangrandi's actions circumscribe different levels of authority at Birkbeck in the period. The professor's idiosyncratic behaviour and the resistances shown to it help to define limits of individual, departmental and institutional influence. Power relations between these different levels were also revealed during financial trouble. Despite frequent scrutiny freezes and cuts, classics mostly expected to cope, and with college support was able to, at least until the 1980s. Browning's response to the master's dismal financial forecast of February 1969 was not despondency. Rather, the head of the department thought an increase to his staff should not be ruled out in case the economic situation improved. Similarly, an appeal by Browning to the master in January 1980 for a replacement secretary, despite a college recruitment freeze, was informal and optimistic in tone. Even allowing for requisite politeness between senior academics, such correspondence shows faith in the master's ability to help mitigate the impact of institutional cutbacks. Indeed, Birkbeck's support of classics was formally recognised in February 1980 following a college review of the department, conducted, in its words, at a time of financial crisis. The internal report concluded that classics was unique in Britain, providing the only option for part-time degree study of classical language and literature. It recommended that the college should maintain a viable department of classics at undergraduate and postgraduate levels. At the start of the 1980s then, classics could still believe that Birkbeck, even under acute financial strain, would continue to offer institutional backing for its unique teaching and research. What perhaps couldn't have been foreseen, however, was the extent of change for classics over the next decade as a result of political shifts beyond Birkbeck. The situation became critical from July 1985, when the UGC set up a working party on the discipline, chaired by Professor J.P. Barron of the ICS. Barron claimed that the nationwide audit aimed to protect classics through concentration into centres of strength and avoiding uneconomic activities. Barron's team asked Birkbeck directly for various data on its classics departments, including application numbers, teaching and research records, and staff-student ratios. The Working Party's verdict on 5th of November 1987 was a hammer blow. Its recommendations included the closure of classics at Birkbeck with a transfer of staff to King's College. According to its report, Birkbeck's department was too small and did not have adequate student demand. Critically, however, the UGC's audit made no mention of part-time teaching and research. While the exceptionality of evening courses and supervision within classics had been recognised at institutional level, the UGC's national report failed to acknowledge it. Birkbeck's master, Baroness Tessa Blackstone, sent a stern statement in response to the UGC, stressing that the college was the only place in Britain to offer evening university education in classics and calling for the closure to be stopped. Similar appeals were mounted in the national press, including an editorial in the Times. The UGC closure of classics at Birkbeck went ahead in 1989-90 despite the protests, but with a compromise. While the department's staff were transferred to King's College, Dr. Jane Rowlinson was seconded back to run a reduced classics program. Rowlinson thus remained at Birkbeck, largely to support existing part-time BA and MA students. New student numbers for the diminished department were capped, and recruitment to the program after autumn 1989 was subject to continuous review. There was perhaps a sense of phasing out. For Jen Grandy in particular, transfer to King's meant an official end to postgraduate supervision. Considering the disruptions imposed by the UGC, the response of Birkbeck's classics staff was remarkable. Most notably, Rowlinson maintained a classics program at the college beyond the immediate short term and into the 1990s. According to Meyer, the university had seen the lecturer's role as one of oversight for existing students. In addition, Rowlinson secured new admissions, against the university's expectations, if not its new rules. Transgressions were also made by Jen Grandy, who accepted new postgraduates unofficially at King's. Emma Dench, who succeeded Rowlinson in July 1992, recalled a furtive atmosphere, stating that it felt to me almost like a secret operation that the classics degrees were still running. The new recruit, hired by the Department of History to oversee Birkbeck's reduced classics program, was only 29 and still to receive her DPhil from Oxford on taking up the role. Dench said she remembered entering a very difficult, highly political situation and that it was terrifying. Dench said she was able to continue a part-time classics program with, quote, unbelievably generous help from academic colleagues. In one way, this was individual, with Rowlinson offering one-to-one guidance on the new classics setup even after her official departure. But it was also collective, with ex-Birkbeck classics staff now at King's, plus other colleagues from across the university, known as the Classics Consortium, rescheduling daytime classes to help provide evening tuition for part-time students. Dench also said she drew strength from Birkbeck students, the majority of whom were mature and part-time. She said that those on the continuing classics program came from all walks of life and were highly committed. She remembered one student based in Peterborough who taught himself Greek during regular rail commutes to the college. Dench said she was particularly proud of having secured the reinstatement of beginners Latin and Greek at Birkbeck by the mid-1990s because it completely opened up classics to those who hadn't studied the subject at school. The move also meant that the classics program, under history, could recruit more students and thus increase the likelihood of its own survival. Such progress resulted in the appointment of a classics academic, a second classics academic by the late 1990s, and the eventual incorporation of the discipline into a joint School of History, Classics and Archaeology by 1999-2000. As Dench recalled, this reflected that classics was here to stay. This paper has introduced novel perspectives on the contemporary history of classics and British higher education more broadly, through a close examination of one department of one institution from 1963 to 2003. Subsequently, this paper presents four conclusions. Firstly, that classics at Birkbeck in the period can be most usefully understood not as a teaching and research unit, but as an academic community, one with its own concerns and links inside and outside of the college. Secondly, that classics comprise complex interpersonal relationships, sometimes resulting in conflict, and that such clashes can help to circumscribe limits of authority and agency at different levels, individual, departmental, institutional. Thirdly, that with institutional support, this community was able to withstand a number of difficulties in the 1960s and 70s, prior to a pivotal year of 1980-81. And fourthly, that a most significant aspect in the recent history of classics at Birkbeck was the determination of academics and students to continue their work, significantly including part-time, even in the face of departmental dissolution. Ultimately, it is this continued communal pursuit of knowledge that defined classics at the college during the period, and it is this sustained intellectual endeavour, despite shifts in policy and circumstances that might most effectively help us to understand the purpose of a department and institution specializing in part-time teaching and research. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that just amazing history of an incredibly resilient department and very strong and dedicated faculty members. We have a couple of questions in the chat. I'm going to put them together into one. Siren asks if during this time there was any discussion of the usefulness of classics as a part of the examination of the department. And then Joanna asks about whether or not this conflict that you describe in your paper was also about the difference between European and UK models of the professoriate. And so I thought those were two particularly interesting elements of the questions that have been posted. And so I'd love it if you could offer us some comments on those ideas.
Thank you very much. And I should say just briefly, sorry for hiding behind my slides. My laptop is so old I couldn't manage to record myself and the slides at the same time. But to go back to the questions, I think there's a couple of deeper trends that underlie this whole paper. And to start with the European question, I think for sure there's a suggestion, or it was suggested to me by Roland Meyer, who was one of the ex-heads who's still around, who I interviewed, that part of Giangrandi's attempt was to import a sort of Italian model into Birkbeck, which I remember him saying was never going to fly, in his words. Leaving aside the sort of personal tensions that existed around the attempt, I think partly what was interesting about it was Giangrandi, in a way, was slightly ahead of the curve. He had developed and did develop right through his career quite a wide network of contacts, publishing contacts, and peers and research students across Europe, in the Netherlands, in Greece, in Italy, in Spain, and struggled at Birkbeck probably to really capitalize on it, because he wanted to create his research entity so that he could get more funding to do more with this international network. It was probably just a bit too far ahead in terms of where British universities were at that stage. And also there's a sort of deeper political problem around this time with the government's attempts to start establishing a market within the university sector, which at times depended on restrictions of international students, just as Giangrandi is trying to capitalize on his network. To go on to the usefulness of classics, I guess there's another sort of deeper trend that runs under this paper, which is about the split views of classics among classics academics at the time, amongst the university staff at the time, as to what direction the subject was heading in, and should it be strictly about the language? Should it be more about something that looks a bit more like classical studies? And should linguistic ability be a prerequisite for admissions? Obviously, we know it's gone in the direction of both in a way. Most universities now have probably some sort of classical studies MA is not, or degree is not, doesn't require languages. Somebody like Giangrandi for sure would have been adamant that you can't possibly take on classics without at least Greek or Latin, preferably with more than one European language, given that there's so much literature around the classics in different languages. So this is also partly the tensions within the department relate to this underlying trend. And just lastly on this topic, there's also this sort of long history of classics as an elite subject, or wrongly viewed really as an elite subject. There's a long history. I think it's Hall and Stead's book about the working class relationship with classics education. But you only have to listen to politicians on the radio today to know that it's still used as the method of demonstrating some sort of distinction, if you can reference classical literature. And so the question that comes in towards the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, and through the 90s at Birkbeck about keeping this access for part-time students, people who hadn't had access to the classics at school. It was important then. I think it's still important now. I hope that helps.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate the comments and you being here with us today.